Welcome to Reformed Thinking. We are thrilled you could join us today. Come pull up a chair right here with us. You are the third person in the room for a very specific, intensive investigation into the text.
I am very glad to be here. Today our target is Psalm 100. We are looking at Charles Spurgeon's massive, multi-volume work, The Treasury of David.
Yes, and specifically we are focusing on his exposition, his explanatory notes, and the quaint sayings he collected from various theologians regarding this famous doxology.
Our mission today is to unpack the theological weight, the historical context, and the daily application of this passage.
And we will be looking at all of this through the lens of Reformed theology and the Westminster Confession. We want to make sure we get to the core of these ideas without getting bogged down in information overload.
So settle in, because we are going to walk through this verse by verse, discovering how a psalm written thousands of years ago speaks directly to your daily life right now.
Let us look at the unique inscription first. Psalm 100 is the only psalm in the entire collection bearing the precise title, a psalm of praise, or, as some translators render it, a psalm of thanksgiving.
Spurgeon notes with great enthusiasm that the text is entirely ablaze with grateful adoration.
I mean, out of 150 psalms, this is the solitary one explicitly designated in this specific way.
The historical and liturgical background of that specific title gives us a massive clue about how this text functioned in ancient Israel.
Right. If we look at the notes from Samuel Berder, he points out a very specific contextual reality.
He does. This psalm was likely sung when the sacrifices of thanksgiving were actively being offered in the temple.
He references Leviticus chapter 7, verse 12, which details the peace offering.
As those familiar with the Levitical system know, the peace offering was not given for the expiation of sin. It was purely an expression of gratitude.
So picture the sensory reality of that ancient scene. You have worshipers bringing their offerings, acknowledging the goodness of Jehovah.
You have the smell of the altar, the gathering of the community.
And as that physical sacrifice was being prepared, this specific psalm was the accompanying soundtrack.
The Greeks even believed it was written by David to invite the entire world to join the Israelites in recognizing the divine sovereignty of God.
It was not intended to be a localized song for a regional event. It was a universal summons tied to a very physical act of gratitude.
That universal summons actually fits into a much larger structural picture within the Psalter itself.
When you look at J.J.S. Perone's commentary from the sources, he views Psalms 93 through 99 as one continuous prophetic oratorio.
He calls this massive musical sequence, Jehovah is King.
When you read those preceding psalms, you hear this building, swelling theme of God's universal reign being established over the earth.
And then we hit Psalm 100. Perone describes this specific psalm as the grand doxology that closes that entire musical strain.
It breathes this massive gladness and is filled with the hope that all nations, absolutely everyone, will bow down to him.
To capture this feeling, the speaker's commentary uses a brilliant metaphor.
It compares this promise of Christianity contained in Psalm 100 to winter holding the promise of spring.
You know that specific feeling when the clouds are heavy with rain, the light soil is ready, the sun is shining in its strength, and you are just waiting for a south wind to bring new life to everything?
Yes, that is the prophetic tension of this doxology.
That tension and release has resonated through centuries of church history, generating a massive musical legacy.
Spurgeon points out how this psalm has been a favorite for God's people as long as there have been loyal subjects to the great king.
We have the famous Old Hundredth, which remains a staple in the Christian church today.
We have Isaac Watts' majestic paraphrase, beginning before Jehovah's awful throne.
And the classic Scottish version, all people that on earth do dwell.
Spurgeon even mentions Tate and Brady rising beyond their usual standard when they translated it for congregational use.
But the historical note from Ingram Cobbin adds another fascinating layer to this musical heritage.
Cobbin notes that Martin Luther immortalized his name by writing the majestic air and harmony for this psalm.
Cobbin says Luther's arrangement, when sung in a truly worshiping frame, seems to bring heaven down to earth and raise earth to heaven.
It gives believers an anticipation of that pure, sublime delight of the General Assembly in glory.
The theology is carried by the harmony, uniting the voice of the church across centuries and continents.
That concept of heaven brought to earth introduces the very first verse perfectly. Make a joyful noise unto the Lord, all ye lands.
Let us look at that phrase, joyful noise, for a moment.
Spurgeon defines this original word not as a pleasant melody, but as a glad shout.
He compares it to the spontaneous, overwhelming shout that loyal subjects give when their king suddenly appears among them.
It is an involuntary, joyful roar of recognition.
He argues that our happy God should be worshipped by a happy people because a cheerful spirit aligns entirely with his nature and his acts.
Every land sees Jehovah's goodness, so every land should offer this glad shout.
Spurgeon issues a striking statement here about the future of the world based on this verse.
He says the world will never reach its proper condition until, with one unanimous shout, it adores the only God.
The world's golden age is waiting for all nations to revere him.
Spurgeon's point about the golden age waiting on this unanimous reverence reflects the core theological stance that God is not a tribal deity.
Right, he is the sovereign ruler over every square inch of creation.
A call for all lands to make a glad shout is a prophetic declaration of God's rightful ownership.
Every nation, every culture, every individual owes this glad homage because his sovereignty is universal.
In Reformed thought, recognizing God's absolute authority is not a burden. It is the source of true human flourishing.
The rebellion of the nations is seen as a tragic anomaly, an unnatural state of blindness.
The joyful noise, that glad shout of the loyal subjects, is the sound of creation functioning the way it was designed to function.
It is acknowledging the absolute, uncontested kingship of Jehovah.
How does this universal call actually influence how we approach our times of corporate worship?
That brings us to verse 2. Carry out your duties to the Lord with gladness. Come before his presence with singing.
Let us look at that first instruction regarding gladness. Spurgeon uses a brilliant analogy here.
He says the invitation to worship is not a melancholy one. We are not being called to a funeral solemnity.
Instead, it is a cheery, gladsome exhortation as though we were bidden to a marriage feast.
So often people conflate reverence with misery. They assume that to be solemn and serious about God, you must be gloomy.
But Spurgeon vehemently rejects that posture. He says we must come before him not with weepings and wailings, but with psalms and hymns.
Our approach must not be performed in the servility of fear.
To add to this, Thomas Watson has a beautiful insight.
He says it is a sign that the oil of grace has been poured into the heart when the oil of gladness shines on the countenance.
Watson states that cheerfulness actually credits religion. It makes the truth of the gospel visible and attractive to the watching world.
The contrast between servile fear and genuine gladness is a critical distinction for anyone holding to the Westminster Confession.
Servile fear is the dread of a slave anticipating punishment,
whereas the gladness Spurgeon and Watson describe flows from filial awe, the joyful reverence of a child for a loving father.
This naturally extends into the second part of verse 2, regarding singing as a constant approach to God.
Spurgeon issues a very strong rebuke to anyone who forbids singing in public worship.
He calls it a riddle he cannot solve, wondering how any society of brethren could find it in their hearts to suppress such a joyous exercise.
He leans on Dr. Isaac Watts to make his point, quoting the famous lines.
Let those refuse to sing who never knew our God, but favorites of the heavenly King must speak his praise abroad.
For Spurgeon, the measured, harmonious, hearty utterance of praise by a congregation is not an optional extra. It is delightful and necessary.
It is an actual fit anticipation of the worship of heaven.
In that eternal state, he notes, praise will absorb prayer, becoming the sole mode of adoration.
That anticipation of heaven does not stop when the church service ends.
This is where George Bowen's perspective completely shifts the paradigm.
Bowen takes this command to carry out our duties with gladness and applies it to the most mundane aspects of human existence.
He says it is our privilege to please the Lord in all things, even in something as simple as loosing the latchet of a shoe.
We can enjoy the expression of his favor right there, in that tiny everyday action.
Bowen paints a picture of a believer who is not hired for occasional tasks.
We are not punching a time clock for God. We abide in the employ of our Master continuously.
Whether a person eats, drinks, sleeps, walks, talks, or even finds recreation, it is all done by way of honoring God.
Bowen's analogy of the dejected worker is incredibly convicting when you apply it to your daily routine.
He asks if you could bear to be waited upon by a worker who goes moping and dejected to his every task.
His conclusion is that you would rather have no worker at all than one who evidently finds the work cheerless and irksome.
Applying this to our relationship with God, if we carry out our daily obligations with a constant spirit of dejection and resentment, we are fundamentally misrepresenting our Master.
Whether that is managing a household, crunching numbers in an office, or interacting with our neighbors.
Notice that joy is inextricably linked to glorification.
When we approach our daily vocations with a settled, deep-seated gladness, we are testifying to the goodness of God's providence over our specific life circumstances.
The oil of gladness changes the very nature of our everyday labor, turning ordinary tasks into acts of fragrant worship.
Let us shift from the posture of our worship to the intellectual foundation of our faith.
We are looking at verse 3, "Know ye that the Lord, He is God."
Spurgeon lays down a massive marker here. He insists that our worship must be intelligent.
We must know whom we worship and why we are doing it.
He references the famous ancient aphorism, "Man, know thyself," and says that while that is wise, knowing our God is truer wisdom.
In fact, Spurgeon finds it highly questionable whether a person can actually know themselves at all until they first know their God.
Knowing Jehovah in his exclusive character, as God alone, and proving that knowledge through obedience, trust, submission, zeal, and love is an attainment that only grace can bestow.
You cannot work up this knowledge on your own. It requires divine illumination to practically recognize His Godhead and offer acceptable praise.
David Dixon builds on that necessity of divine grace by pointing out our inherent resistance to this truth.
Dixon observes that from this exhortation to know that the Lord, He is God, we learn a hard truth about human nature.
We suffer from what he calls natural atheism.
Because of this inherent condition, we require constant instruction again and again that the Lord is God, and that of Him, through Him, and for Him are all things.
Dixon is pointing straight to our total depravity here.
As those who hold to the confession, we know the mind is affected by the fall, but Dixon phrases it as this stubborn, internal atheism.
Our natural disposition is to suppress the truth of God's sovereignty.
Therefore, the command to know is not about gathering intellectual data. It is a call to actively fight against our internal resistance through the constant application of God's truth to our minds and hearts.
We need to be repeatedly instructed because our default setting is to forget our Creator and assume ownership of our own lives.
That assumption of ownership is precisely what Spurgeon tackles next, and he does not hold back.
He looks at the phrase, "It is He that hath made us, and not we ourselves."
Spurgeon highlights how some men live as if they actually made themselves.
They proudly claim the title of self-made men, and in doing so, they end up adoring their supposed creators, which is just themselves.
But believers recognize the true origin of their being. They take absolutely no honor to themselves for existing or for being what they are.
Spurgeon says that disclaiming honor for ourselves is as necessary a part of true reverence as ascribing glory to the Lord.
We dare not put even a single finger upon the glory, for it is the sole right and property of the Almighty.
The believer's perpetual confession is not unto us, O Lord.
Spurgeon directly addresses the philosophical arguments of his day concerning origins to drive this point home.
To maintain strict impartiality, we are simply reporting Spurgeon's viewpoint from the text provided here.
Spurgeon critiques the philosophy of development from atoms, or natural selection, which posits that things have essentially made themselves.
He argues that if this theory ever signs believers, there will remain no reason to accuse superstitious people of credulity.
From his perspective, the amount of credence necessary to accept the dogma that floating atoms fashion themselves over a long chain of natural selections is 1,000-fold greater than the belief required for absurd superstitions.
Like winking Madonnas and smiling Bambinos.
He states that he finds it far easier to believe that the Lord made us.
Spurgeon's stance is rooted in the conviction that any philosophy attributing the origin of life to unguided natural processes fundamentally contradicts the revelation of God's exclusive creative prerogative.
To understand how exhaustive that creative prerogative really is, we need to look at David Clarkson's systematic breakdown.
Clarkson outlines a 4-point theological framework regarding God's property in all things, and it is incredibly detailed.
First, Clarkson points out that God made all things for himself.
He was not employed by anyone else to make the world for another owner. He undertook and finished the work for his own purposes and glory.
He did not build this universe and then hand the keys over to humanity as if we were the primary beneficiaries. The entire structure exists for his glory alone.
That first point sets the stage for the second, which is creation ex nihilo, out of nothing.
Clarkson uses the analogy of a potter to illustrate this.
A potter might form a clay vessel, but if the clay belongs to someone else, the potter is not the full owner.
The form is his, but the matter is another's. If the owner of the clay demands his material back, the potter's form is destroyed.
But because God created out of nothing, he owns the matter and the form entirely.
There is no pre-existing material that he had to negotiate with or borrow.
This absolute origination of both the substance and the design gives him an uncontested claim over every atom in the universe.
Clarkson's third point emphasizes the solitary nature of this work.
He notes that God made all things without the help or concurrence of any other.
There was absolutely no assistant cooperating with him in the work of creation.
Often, those who assist in making something can claim a share of ownership in the final product.
A builder who works alongside an architect has some claim to the labor put into the house, but that claim does not exist here.
The Lord alone did all of it, so all of it is exclusively His.
There is no secondary party who can demand recognition or a share of the glory for how the universe was constructed.
The fourth point is perhaps the most staggering for our daily reality.
Clarkson notes that God upholds all things every single moment in the exact same manner as He created them.
He continues their being. He does this of Himself without any external support.
If He did not actively bear them up every moment, all things would fall into nothing in an instant.
This is the doctrine of providence, and it is crucial. We are not wound up like a clock and left to tick on our own.
Our existence and our well-being are derived from Him continuously.
Every breath you take is actively sustained by the will of the Creator. This continuous upholding cements His total, unyielding ownership over us.
How does this theological concept of God's absolute ownership provide comfort when the rubber meets the road in real life?
The sources give us two incredible historical anecdotes that make this very concrete.
The first comes from the year 1237, recorded by Roger of Wendover.
Emperor Henry was out hunting on Quinquagesima Sunday, which is the Sunday right before Ash Wednesday, for those keeping track of the liturgical calendar.
He gets separated from his companions and comes unattended to the edge of a wood.
He sees a church, goes in, feigns being a simple soldier, and requests a mass.
The priest there was known for his piety, but he was so physically deformed that this historical account says he seemed more like a monster than a man.
The emperor was actually wondering why God would permit someone so physically unappealing to administer sacraments.
But then the service begins. A boy is chanting the passage, "Know ye that the Lord, He's God," and he sings it negligently.
This deformed priest stops, rebukes the boy loudly, and sings with a booming voice, "It is He that hath made us, and not we ourselves."
The emperor is so struck by the priest's piety and his complete joyful submission to the fact that God made him exactly as he was, that he elevates this priest to the archbishopric of Cologne.
The priest's acceptance of divine ownership completely transcended his physical reality.
The second historical anecdote brings an immense emotional weight to this doctrine of ownership.
We read a note from F. Delitzsch regarding the Protestant reformer Philip Melanchthon.
In July of 1559, Melanchthon was in Dresden, standing disconsolately sorrowful over the dead body of his son.
In that moment of agonizing grief, Delitzsch notes that Melanchthon drew massive consolation from this exact phrase, "He made us, and we are His."
In the face of death and loss, the realization that the Creator is also the owner brought an anchor to his soul.
Delitzsch points out there is a rich mine of comfort here, because the Creator's heart clings to His creature.
The creature owes its entire existence to Him.
When Melanchthon looked at his son, he found solace in the fact that his son belonged entirely to the God who made him.
A God whose love and ownership supersedes even the finality of physical death.
That picture of Melanchthon finding such intense comfort in God's ownership is incredibly moving.
But it makes me wonder, if God's ownership provides that kind of comfort in our darkest moments, how does it dictate our posture moving forward?
We look at verse 4. "Enter into His gates with thanksgiving, and into His courts with praise. Be thankful unto Him, and bless His name."
Spurgeon points out that the word thanksgiving occurring right here is likely where the psalm gets its title.
He says that in all our public gatherings, the rendering of thanks must abound.
He uses this beautiful imagery of the temple, saying our gratitude should be like the incense that completely filled the whole house with smoke.
As long as we are receivers of mercy, we are obligated to be givers of thanks.
And then he talks about moving into the courts. Into whatever court of the Lord you enter, your admission should be the subject of praise.
Thanks be to God, the innermost court is now open to believers.
We actually enter into that which is within the veil, and we must acknowledge that high privilege with our songs.
Jewish scholarship recognized a massive shift in the nature of these sacrifices, which ties directly into our access to that innermost court.
George Phillips quotes the bold claim of Rabbi Menachem regarding the Hebrew word used for the sacrifice of thanksgiving in Leviticus.
Rabbi Menachem stated, "All sacrifices will be abolished, but the sacrifice of thanksgiving will remain."
This insight is monumental. The expiatory sacrifices, the offerings required to cover sin, have reached their end.
The ultimate sacrifice of Christ on the cross fulfilled and abolished the need for any further expiatory offerings.
Because the penalty has been paid, the veil is torn, and the innermost court is permanently open to the believer.
However, the sacrifice of thanksgiving is never out of date. It remains as the perpetual eternal response of the redeemed.
Our access is secured by grace, and our continual response is gratitude.
That gratitude is not supposed to be conditional on our circumstances.
Spurgeon gives a very direct instruction on how to apply the end of verse 4, bless his name.
He tells the reader to bless God's name, his character, and his person.
Whatever God does, you must be sure to bless him for it.
And here is the challenging part. Spurgeon says we must bless him when he takes away as well as when he gives.
We are commanded to bless him as long as we live, under absolutely all circumstances.
And to bless him in all his attributes from whatever point of view we consider him.
This sounds simple enough when reading a commentary, but living it out requires a massive shift in how we view our trials.
Why should you, the listener, care about this level of unconditional gratitude?
Because true gratitude is not dependent on your shifting external circumstances.
If your thankfulness rises and falls based on your current financial status, your health, or your relational success, it is incredibly fragile.
But the command here roots gratitude in the unchangeable character of God.
You can bless him when he takes away, because his nature remains constant.
Your anchor is not the gift, it is the giver.
Recognizing this protects the believer from the despair that comes when earthly circumstances inevitably crumble.
It provides a stable, resilient foundation for the mind, knowing that the God who permitted the loss is the same infinitely good God who provides the breath in your lungs.
That unchangeable character of God is the massive crescendo of this entire text.
Let us look at verse 5, the final verse. For the Lord is good, his mercy is everlasting, and his truth endureth to all generations.
Spurgeon says this single verse sums up God's entire character and contains a mountain of reasons for our praise.
He is good, gracious, kind, bountiful, loving. God is love.
Spurgeon even states that anyone who does not praise the good is not good himself.
The kind of joy and gladness demanded in the previous verses is perfectly urged upon us by this final argument regarding the essential goodness of God.
And regarding his mercy, God is not stern, cold justice. He has bowels of compassion.
Towards his own people, this mercy is conspicuously displayed. It has been theirs from all eternity and will be theirs world without end.
Matthew Henry synthesizes the attributes of Jehovah found in these verses into 7 distinct points.
This provides a brilliant structural framework for understanding exactly who we are worshiping.
First, he is the only living and true God, infinitely perfect and self-existent.
This separates him from the dead idols of the surrounding nations.
Second, he is our creator, the derived source of our being. We did not conjure ourselves into existence.
Third, he is our rightful owner, precisely because he made us out of nothing. We are his property.
Henry's fourth point is that he is our sovereign ruler, the governor who gives laws to us as moral agents and will call us to account.
He does not just own us and leave us be. He actively governs our actions.
Fifth, he is our bountiful benefactor. He takes care of us as the sheep of his pasture, providing for our physical and spiritual needs.
Sixth, he is a God of infinite mercy and goodness. His governance is not tyrannical. It's characterized by deep compassion for his flock.
And Henry's seventh point is that he's a God of inviolable truth and faithfulness.
No word of his will ever fall to the ground as antiquated or revoked.
Understanding these 7 points guards the mind against creating a lesser, localized version of God that caters to our modern preferences.
When we grasp his inviolable truth, we understand that his promises are not subject to the shifting winds of human culture or personal failure.
His truth endures to all generations, meaning the covenant he establishes is as secure today as it was when it was first spoken.
I notice in the notes that Spurgeon goes on a massive theological defense here against the idea that believers can lose their salvation.
How exactly does he connect the unchangeable character of God in verse 5 to the perseverance of the saints?
Spurgeon says that a changeable God would be an absolute terror to the righteous.
If God were a fickle being, promising something and then forgetting it, believers would have no sure anchorage.
Amid a constantly changing world, they would be driven to and fro in perpetual fear of shipwreck.
Spurgeon states that it would be well if the truth of divine faithfulness were more fully remembered by some theologians.
Because it would completely overturn their belief in the final fall of believers and teach them a much more consolatory system.
He says our heart leaps for joy as we bow before one who has never broken his word or changed his purpose.
He quotes the lines, "As well might he his being quit as break his promise or forget."
Spurgeon is taking direct aim at the Arminian view here.
He knows that if you compromise on God's immutability in verse 5, you completely lose the grounds for the perseverance of the saints.
The doctrine of the perseverance of the saints is intrinsically tied to the unchanging character of God, which is precisely what verse 5 declares.
His truth endureth to all generations.
If God's truth and covenant promises could fail based on human weakness, then God himself would be changeable.
But the Reformed view holds that God's electing love and saving grace are unilateral and unbreakable.
He enters into covenant with his people, and he will never revoke it.
As the fathers found him faithful, so will the sons and their seed forever.
Your security is not based on your flawless performance. It is based entirely on God never breaking his word or changing his purpose.
The command to rejoice in verse 1 is only logically possible if the security outlined in verse 5 is absolute.
The joy of the psalmist is fueled by the ironclad guarantee of God's unchangeable truth.
Let us look back over the massive ground we have covered today.
We started with the unique title and the universal prophetic call for a glad shout from all lands, acknowledging God's total sovereignty.
We examine the posture of our worship, realizing that our daily duties, even down to the most mundane tasks, are meant to be carried out with the gladness of a marriage feast, not the gloom of a funeral.
We looked at the firm reality of God as our sovereign creator, completely dismantling any ideology of self-making and resting in his total ownership of our lives.
We walk through the gates of perpetual gratitude, learning to bless his name under all circumstances.
And finally, we anchored ourselves in the secure theological comfort of his unchangeable covenant, knowing that his everlasting mercy and inviolable truth guarantee our eternal security.
As we conclude, there is a final thought I want to leave with you to mull over in your own time.
It builds on a highly specific historical detail from the sources that we haven't touched on yet.
Daniel Cresswell offers a fascinating note about the ancient liturgical practice surrounding this psalm.
He suggests that the first part of the psalm was sung by a precentor, essentially the lead singer or worship leader who directed the congregation, when the peace offering was brought to the altar.
But this final verse, the declaration of God's goodness, mercy, and truth, might have been the grand response sung by the entire company of singers at the exact moment the fire was applied to the offering.
The climax of the song aligned perfectly with the consuming flame.
So here is the question for you to consider today.
If true worship requires offering up our own preferences, our own perceived ownership of our lives, what specific pieces of your daily life are currently waiting on the altar for the fire of gratitude to consume them today?
That is a challenging thought to carry with you.
Thank you so much for joining us for this intensive look into Psalm 100 on Reformed thinking.
We love having you in the room with us for these discussions.
Until next time, keep reading and farewell.